Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
So today we're going to discuss how science, sustainability, and society coalesce and interact, and how embracing this combination can enable greater innovations and result in the carbon management sphere. So Dr. Sallie Greenberg, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today. You've built a long and impactful legacy through an impressive career. Let's start by having you tell our listeners about your background and some of the work you've done in the carbon management space.
Thank you, Holly. It's a delight to be here and to be on the podcast. So my background is that I have an undergraduate degree in geology and environmental science from Alfred University, which is in Western New York, and a master's degree in low-temperature geochemistry from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in secondary and continuing education, also from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And what that combination of degrees has allowed me to do over the course of my career is approach physical science questions through a social science lens. And in the carbon management space, that's incredibly important, to be able to take a 30,000-foot view, understand big picture considerations that have nothing to do with maybe your area of expertise. I've actually gotten to do very little geology over the course of the last 25 years, but there's a lot of room in carbon management for transdisciplinary, cross-boundary work and understanding and relationship building. My background in terms of carbon management is that through the Illinois State Geological Survey at the University of Illinois, I was part of a team that worked with the Department of Energy on the original regional carbon sequestration partnerships. So we had a partnership, the Illinois State Geological Survey combined with the Indiana and Kentucky Geological Surveys led the Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium. We were one of 7 groups funded in 2003 to do standard characterization of a particular geologic feature, the Illinois Basin, which underlies Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, to characterize the potential for carbon capture and storage in that region. That evolved through multiple phases and ultimately led us to develop a project called the Illinois Basin Decatur Project, which is the world's first carbon capture and storage from ethanol and storage in a non-oil-bearing reservoir. So through the 20 years of that work, I've pretty much done everything in the carbon management space. I jokingly call myself a unicorn sometimes because I've been involved in the first Class 6 permits, heavily involved in stakeholder engagement, running projects, pulling technical teams together to do site characterization and monitoring, all the components that go into a carbon management system.
And I would say you've been also very engaged in the carbon capture, carbon management community for a long time and been very welcoming. You're definitely seen as a leader. And from my perspective, you've really taken a lot of pride in that and really mentored younger professionals. I am no longer a young professional, but when I was, you really welcomed me into that group and into that industry and have helped me along the way. So thank you so much for investing in me and many other individuals in this space. You've made a big difference.
I really appreciate that. I think as I get older, and since retiring from the University of Illinois last year and going out on my own as a consultant, it's really the opportunity to help foster other people's careers has really increased a lot. And we need people who are good energy leaders and who have really the ability to see across disciplinary lines And anything I can do in that space to support people to consider our energy and our environmental future in combination and look at really complex situations that we have facing us, I'm going to do whatever I can for as long as I can. So
great. And I think folks in Wyoming are very aware of carbon management and carbon capture, use, and storage. We have the Exxon Chute Creek facility and a robust enhanced oil recovery industry. We have several carbon safe projects either underway or about to become underway in the state. We have lots of activity. But the project you've spent a lot of your career on that you've already mentioned, can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think people don't realize that we have been injecting carbon dioxide just for the sake of storage. Now, this is part of research and development. So there was a lot of science, a lot of social science done during that project, but we don't have any of those projects in Wyoming at this time that are active. So just will you talk a little bit about that? Because I think sometimes there's questions about, is this real? Can we actually do it? And you have been a big part of a project that's been doing it for a very long time. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there's actually 2 projects in Decatur, Illinois, both originated with U.S. Department of Energy funding. The first one, the Illinois Basin Decatur project, was a research project, and a research project designed to take place over a period of about 10 years, where we did pre-injection characterization, monitoring, stakeholder engagement, permit development, all the things you need to do in order to be able to have a carbon storage project that is actually injecting carbon dioxide. So that took about 3 years. The funding came in 2007. The project started in earnest in 2008. It took until 2011 to get the permit to inject under the Class 6 regulatory framework. And the Illinois Basin Decatur project injected 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide per day for 3 years. So because it was a research project, its intent was a particular volume to store 1 million tons of carbon dioxide. It was intended to be a large demonstration project, but not a commercial scale project.
Right.
And associated with that, originally planned, there were 2 to 3 years of post-injection monitoring to take place. But during that time period, during the pre-injection time period, another opportunity to develop a second project came along through American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding. So Archer Daniels Midland, who was the main partner and the host site for the Illinois Basin Decatur project, applied to the Department of Energy for funding for a second project. So the University of Illinois was the prime on the first project, ADM the prime on the second project, with all the same partners and players. The second project added a local community college, Richland Community College, which developed a 2-year technical program for carbon management, which leads to a 4-year degree program. So that's one of the things that's quite different about the second project. But that second project and the first project kind of overlapped during the course of their development, originally intended to be injecting into the same reservoir, overlapping for a year, but due to some challenges in the regulatory space and with the permits, that didn't happen. But the Illinois Industrial Sources CCS project, which is the name of the second project, has been injecting CO2 at Decatur on the order of about 1 million tons per year. So they're injecting anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 tons per day. They've been injecting since 2017 and are currently still injecting. So what we were able to do with the first project and the second project is, because they got combined essentially in the regulatory framework. So the first project, the infrastructure, the deep wells, the monitoring system is also part of the monitoring system for the second project. That's in part led to some of the delays, but it's allowed us to have a very robust system for understanding what is happening to CO2 in the subsurface once it's been injected and stored. So in other words, we're using all of the infrastructure from the first project and the second project to ensure that carbon dioxide is staying where we put it, that we can monitor it using a variety of different technologies. Some are deep subsurface, some are at the surface. And so we can prove, and I can genuinely and proudly say that we have proven that carbon capture and storage is safe and effective and viable and protects human health and the environment.
Great. And just a couple clarifications. So you talked about Class 6. That's the kind of permit you need if you're going to inject CO2 for permanent storage. And then when you're saying deep in the subsurface, how deep in Illinois? How deep are your wells or your target injection zones in Illinois?
So, yeah, let me just, about that first point, the Underground Injection Control Program, which is regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act through the federal EPA. In some states, you have primacy, like in Wyoming. So you regulate the Class 6 well class for injecting
our Department of Environmental Quality, not the School of Energy Resources.
Yes, sorry about that. Good clarification. But in Illinois, the federal EPA, Region 5, regulates that. So anybody who wants to store anything in the subsurface has to have permission to do so. The second point, injection in Illinois at Decatur is at about 6,800 feet beneath the surface. So the target rock formation is the Mount Simon sandstone. It's about 1,500 feet thick at Decatur. In various locations in the Illinois basin, it is deeper and thicker or thinner and shallower. So the Illinois basin is like a big casserole dish that underlies the three states of Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. And it's quite deep in the middle, and the rock, the sedimentary rock, is quite thick. So at Decatur, the top of the Mount Simon is at about 5,500 feet beneath the surface, and it's directly overlain with a shale seal rock called the Eau Claire Shale, which is about 450 feet thick at Decatur. Those rock formations go laterally throughout the Illinois basin. As you get to the edges of the basin, though, they can be quite near the surface. So not everywhere is suitable for storage in those particular formations.
And that's actually a little more shallow than we're looking at injection locations here in Wyoming. So generally we're looking 8,000 feet or below, at least the projects we're working on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You will see projects in Illinois that will also be drilling wells that are approximately that deep. When you're doing early mover projects, you're looking for the best configuration of location, geology, access to carbon dioxide, depth of wells, because all of that costs money to create your infrastructure. We just happened to get incredibly lucky, and it was very fortuitous that we went to ADM in 2005 and said, we'd like to buy CO2 because we're putting in a proposal to the Department of Energy for a large carbon storage project. And ADM said, oh, we're very curious. Tell us more. They're a very research-minded R&D company, and they had a new CEO named Patricia Wirtz at the time who was very environmentally focused. And so we explained how carbon capture and storage works, utilization, the potential for it in the Illinois basin, and they said to us, well, why don't you just do it here on location? So the ability to have a source right where you're storing is not always the case. And the depth to the Mount Simon, as I said, is about 5,500 feet. So our wells are drilled to 7,200 feet, but some of that is Precambrian basement igneous rock. It's not all sedimentary rock.
And for the non-geologist, that means what?
Yeah, so when you are looking to store carbon dioxide, you're looking for a package of rocks. this package of rocks is not dissimilar to what you look for when you're exploring for oil and gas, but you're using it for, instead of extraction purposes, for storage purposes. So what you're looking for is a porous and permeable rock unit like a sandstone. So if you think about a sandstone in macroscopic form, it's like a crate of oranges where all those round spheres touch each other, but they have open space in between them. That's what we call pore space. And so a sandstone has a lot of pore space, which is typically at depths of 8,000, 7,000 feet, filled with a very, very heavy fluid that we call brine. And that brine in Illinois, for example, is on the order of 6 or 7 times saltier than the ocean. So you are storing your liquid-like carbon dioxide in those pore spaces with that brine. Then you want to have an impermeable rock unit like a shale that things don't really pass through, so they don't have pore spaces, or if they do, they're very, very small and disconnected. They don't connect with each other. Permeability means the connectedness of pore spaces. And so you're using that package of rock. One rock is your storage unit, and the other acts as a seal or a cap. And so the reason why that cap rock is important is because once you stop injecting carbon dioxide, the CO2 or carbon dioxide is less dense than the fluid in which it coexists. And so there's a potential for buoyancy or upward migration. So you are spending a lot of time, energy, and resources to store the carbon dioxide. So you want to make sure it stays in the reservoir where you are storing it, so that seal acts as an upward barrier so that carbon dioxide won't leak to the surface.
Perfect. So we've diverted to geology, and although geology and engineering, they're really an important focus, we do a lot of work on those topics here at the School of Energy Resources related to carbon management. But there's increasing awareness in the role that social dynamics play in the long-term success of these projects, and really all energy projects. I think it's fair to say you were one of the first to see that and use your technical background for stakeholder engagement. When and why did you start to move toward a focus in stakeholder engagement?
So actually, that's kind of my entry into carbon capture and storage. There was a gentleman who many of us know, Dr. Robert Finley, who was previously at the Bureau of Economic Geology in Texas, at the University of Texas. And he came to the University of Illinois, the Illinois State Geological Survey, in the year 2000, and really started our work on carbon storage. So I had found out from him, or, it was being talked about in the hallways of the Geological Survey, that we'd gotten this big project. And at the time, I was thinking about what is my exit strategy, because I was getting sort of tapped out in my career at the survey. But I was doing a lot of professional development for teachers, and I was very interested in hands-on learning for geology. And one of my superpowers, if you will, is being able to translate complex geologic concepts to simpler terms so people can understand what it is that we're talking about. And I went up to Dr. Finley in the hallway and I said, "Hey, I hear you got this grant. Is there any education component to it?" And he literally stopped dead in his tracks and he was like, "Oh my God, are you kidding? We have this whole piece that we don't even know how we're going to do or deliver, that is developing a curriculum and materials for how to explain what we're doing. Can you start working on it full time?" And I was like, "Well, no, I actually have a laboratory job that I still have to do." So for the first couple of years, I did 2 jobs. I ran the isotope geochemistry lab, and I did all of the educational outreach and materials development for our carbon storage program. And then over time, because I was good at that, but I'm also a geologist and I have a really solid technical background, I increasingly sat in meetings, learned how things were working, and got pulled in to explain that to policymakers and legal teams. And it sort of naturally evolved, and it was very clear that engagement was a necessary component and that people needed to be brought along in order to understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, but also have a voice. And I didn't start out to be a scientist or an engineer. And I think that kind of knowing how hard it was to develop that gave me the natural ability to talk to people and build relationships and start those conversations. One other piece is that the Department of Energy, from the very beginning of the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership Program, had an outreach working group. So each of the partnerships had a lead in that area, and we got together frequently. So very early on, we were working on best practices documents. I was part of the World Resources Institute's stakeholder engagement, and CCS, they did guidelines for carbon capture and storage, but they also did a separate volume on stakeholder engagement because it was clear that the recommendations and the needs were not the same in those two areas, the technical side and the social side of things.
And so what does a really effective public engagement and education strategy look like to you? And maybe on the flip side, what does a successful approach look like? And what are the pitfalls that really need to be avoided? Or what can happen if you don't really undertake public engagement, outreach, and education the right way?
It's a challenging, tricky space because I think one of the hardest things is to know when to start. There's never exactly the right moment to start or exactly the right place to start. And so one of the things you need to be able to do is start where you're at. And in some places, some situations, I've seen engagement programs that were really successful starting at the state level, or others that have been really successful starting at the local level. But at some point, you have to be engaging at the national and federal level. You have to be engaging at your state or regional level, and you need to be engaging at that very project-based neighborhood level. And it is really good engagement is a two-way conversation that is really about exchanging information, listening, and doing it repeatedly. So if you go into, say, a town hall meeting or something, and you present your project once, and there's not a lot of time to digest the information, or there's not a lot of time for questions or people's voices to be heard, and you only do that once, and then you sort of go away and you do all the technical stuff you need to do or the permitting that you need to do and that sort of thing, that kind of leaves a bad taste in people's mouths because we don't learn something the very first time we hear it. You often hear something, you talk about it with your neighbors, you think about it, you do a little reading on the internet, whatever, but you always end up with more questions. And so that's where the relationship part of engagement becomes really critical. And that's where an organization like SER is so important because you hold that space for the state of Wyoming, just like we held that space, or I held that space for the state of Illinois through the Illinois State Geological Survey. And as objective science-based professionals who were there really just to answer questions and to build the relationships and to bring in other stakeholders who needed to be at the table, that gives you really a privileged position to be able to ask hard questions, answer hard questions, that sort of thing. And, I have a lot of great stories. One of my favorite experiences was I, in the early days, had a very elaborate model that showed what happened with carbon storage in the subsurface. And I was giving my spiel to a group of farmers. And a farmer said to me, yeah, look, I get it. But what I want to know is, are you going to damage my property? And is this going to impact the legacy of me giving this land to my children and future generations? And this guy stopped me in my tracks because he was like, he didn't necessarily care about all the technical details, which obviously I gave you earlier in this conversation. Mm-hmm. He really had his own questions. And so, I mean, the thing I would say to anybody who wants to do this work, the best thing to do is to learn to listen for the question that people are not asking, because they're asking you a question, but they often mean something different with the question that they're asking. And another good example of that is, I could tell you the 10 questions I got asked or I get asked over and over and over again. And what I find really fascinating is that they're the same questions that we as researchers or professionals in the carbon management space are asking. So what happens in the event of an earthquake? How do you know the carbon dioxide stays in the subsurface where you put it? So we have a whole arm of the work that we do that is devoted to monitoring, which is devoted to answering the question of how do you know that the CO2 stays in the subsurface? You have a regulatory framework that is asking that same question. So being able to be the translator and the relationship builder in that space is what stakeholder engagement is really about.
And I totally agree. I want to acknowledge what you said. I think, obviously SCR, we're part of the university, we're a nonprofit. We have nothing to gain from a specific project moving forward. We are involved with some of the projects in that we are part of the federal funding opportunity that is supporting some of the science and outreach work around these projects. But, we live here. We live in Wyoming. We're part of the communities. And so we want to make sure, when someone asks us a question, we're going to be answering it very objectively. And it is a very important role. And I think one we take very seriously. I've been, and I think the team here is really impressed by how sophisticated a lot of the questions are. I think it has to do with Wyoming having such a robust energy sector already that the questions are very sophisticated. They can be interested in like what formations are being targeted for storage, but it's not as much around or how are you going to keep it there. I mean, folks know what's under their what their land consists of and what's in the subsurface. I think questions that we'll get are related to water, making sure this isn't going to impact any sources of water, making sure it's not going to impact any future minerals development. And because the industry is so new, we get questions about how do we know that we're getting a fair deal for our pore space? So landowners, they can lease that pore space. It is a commodity and it's a non-infinite commodity. They want to make sure they're getting a good deal. How do you know you're getting a good deal when a technology or carbon management industry is just starting off? So I think it's really incumbent on having very good industry partners and being careful with who we work with. And I would just say we have some really great examples of folks we're working with who have brokered deal because they're not 100% sure, we're setting the market right now. And so they're trying to figure out what should they offer, what's a fair deal, and they can still make the project go forward. And we've seen folks like Frontier Carbon Solutions actually go back to original landowners or put clauses in their contract saying, if we offer someone else more than you're getting, we'll come back to you. And so having that kind of industry partner, I think, is setting up the deployment really well for success, especially as we're at these early stage of adding projects in Wyoming and the Rocky Mountain region. I will tell you what keeps us up at night. And I think you mentioned this. It's really important to know where to start in your outreach, but also when to start. Like, you have an idea, that is not the time to tell everyone you're doing this project. If you don't have a location or haven't looked at energy or don't really have a CO2 source, or, all you have is like part of a capture technology, that is not the time to announce your project. You need to do more due diligence. I think you can engage with folks in communities, especially landowners, early and say, here's what we're thinking about doing, and be really honest about where you are. And I get that there's a balance for some of these early startups trying to get good investment from the investment community and needing to be really attracted to that, but actually not overselling where you are in the development phase. That is what keeps me up at night. We've been working on this industry for 20 years. We're at the cusp of deployment, and I'm seeing projects get announced, quite frankly, before some of them are ready. And we're scared about what that could mean to the ones that really are ready, that aren't quite as loud.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are what make this so complicated. And, one thing I've seen in the stakeholder space or in the engagement space is if you go in too early and you don't have details, it's very frustrating. And people have questions. And you, like you said, you have a sophisticated audience. And Illinois doesn't have necessarily the same industries. We have some of the same industries as Wyoming. Certainly we're a coal-bearing state, and we're a very heavy agricultural state. We do have oil, but not the degree of enhanced oil recovery that you have here in Wyoming. But we, like you, have people who have lived and operated on the land for 100+ years and are very sophisticated about what that means. And something that I think is a big mistake that's happening is not coming to these activities in terms of carbon capture, utilization, and storage with new business-minded entities or with flexible models in place for how you put together projects or agreements, all the things that you mentioned. Because if we come at this with a business as usual approach, what we're not taking into consideration is the sophistication of the people who have so many things wrapped up in their land, their identity, their self-worth, their history, their legacy, their
inheritance for their children.
Yeah, everything. And they're super smart about all of that. That's what that farmer, he was like, he said to me, I go back to that guy all the time, and he was like, he was asking me questions about hydraulics and, if you change this, what's going to happen in the soil system? And, super, super sophisticated about what happens in terms of impact on the land. And if we don't have those conversations and bring people in early enough, it's a problem. But like you also pointed out, if you do it too soon, it's also not good. That's where I think the difference between what happens at a regional or a state level in terms of education or policy or ideas of, hey, this is a thing that's going to happen in Wyoming. This is how it connects to Wyoming. This is how it connects to our enhanced oil recovery activities. This is how it connects to our environmental objectives and our legacy. All of those things are important to have sort of a general conversation about. And then when you start to get into the specifics of projects, it's not a complete mystery to people of what is happening.
Yeah. I think if you're starting to look at a project, it's not necessarily a bad thing to go meet with members of a community and certainly the landowners. It's just be really careful about explaining where you are in your process. If you're still scoping, don't pretend like it's a project that you're sure is going to move forward.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen for a project before a project, a lot of things that need to happen before a project goes forward. One of the things that we always did in the projects that I worked on and led where we looked for ways to bring landowners in. So we drilled shallow groundwater wells on people's property and monitored those for free and gave them the results so that we could assure them on a monthly and an annual basis that there is no change in the water quality. Or there are ways where we have certain landowners who are willing to have a well pad on their property who say, we'll host the well and there can be a financial benefit to that. The question, I just want to go back to one thing that you said, though, about pore space agreements and leasing pore space or royalties for pore space. And that is a question that's being asked around the country. And I don't think that there is a set model or a set way that that's being gone about, but we see it reflected through the Farm Bureau in Illinois. How do you know you're getting a good deal? When do you agree? When don't you agree? When do you hold out? What are your neighbors getting? And the thing I would say is to encourage people to be open and transparent and work with industry groups or lawyers who specialize in these sorts of things. And that idea of having a clause where there can be a change based on an evolution of what happens with a project or payouts later on is a really great idea.
And I think we actually have a study underway. It's being led by Professor Tara Brigetti, and it's funded by the Department of Energy. And it is attempting to come up with essentially a formula. There is never going to be a number because how easy it is to inject CO2 into your subsurface under your land, that's a factor. How far are you from pipelines? How far are you from the emissions source? What are your state regulatory framework conditions? All these things are going to play into that value. So it'll never be some number. And so we are trying, or she with her team that she's working with, they're attempting to come up with some sort of formula, get it through the peer reviewed process. But that just shows you where we are, is that they're still working on that. So back to the discussion around public engagement. A lot of this early stage work is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, very common as a technology is in the early stages of demonstration and deployment. The DOE requires many federally funded projects to develop what are called community benefits plans. Can you explain what are those?
So a community benefit plan has 4 parts to it, really. And it is the federal government's way of ensuring that funds that are being spent on particular categories of projects, in this case, projects that address climate change and or energy, follow a set of best practices or considerations that ensure that communities are brought along in terms of projects. So those 4 parts are: what is your stakeholder engagement strategy? How are you going to communicate and engage with communities? Who in communities are you going to engage with? And they want you to be very specific. These types of churches, these sorts of environmental groups, SER, whoever it is, whoever your identified stakeholders are. How are you going to identify stakeholders, and what sort of relationship building are you going to do? There's another diversity, equity, and inclusion component that holds the recipient of the funding to diversity principles, but also how are you going to engage with communities to be inclusive. There's another component about workforce development, which you guys are particularly strong in and focused on. And then the 4th component is something called Justice 40, which relates to the distribution of federal funds to potentially over-impacted areas or areas that have traditionally borne the burden of energy projects over time. So all of those things get written up into a plan that is a dynamic living document that between the funding recipient and the Department of Energy that evolves over time. So you set out a set of ideas, what you think you're going to do, and then as you go, you adapt that for what is really needed. But the idea, the principle behind a CBP is that you as a funding recipient have given a lot of thought to how you're going to engage with communities and what the benefits and harms are going to be, or potential benefits and harms are going to be, and how to ensure that communities are engaged.
And that's great. And I think it's something Wyoming in particular, I feel like, has done engaging with the community for a long time, because we are the community, right? And actually in some places, some of these projects, there is no community per se. And so I will say some aspects of these CBPs are a little bit hard to implement in the rural Mountain West. It does feel sometimes like the requirements were made for perhaps more populated areas than what we have. And also understanding that Wyoming is an energy state, but it is also a landowner rights state. And both of those are very strong sentiments, and you can have both. So I think not just Wyoming, but kind of rural energy states in general already do a pretty good job of this, maybe not perfect, but I have a hard time with some of the CBP requirements, and we're doing our best, but it doesn't always feel like a one size fit all.
Yeah, let me just add. I mean, I agree, but the point is it can't be a one size fit all. And this is where some of the original wisdom behind the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership Program, and they still have regional partnerships. It's a little bit different than it was, but you know your state and your community best. And so the CBPs, they have guidelines, they have specific requirements. But the fact of the matter is, if you cannot deliver to the letter of what is in the guidance, it is a guidance. Yeah. And you then say, well, this doesn't work in Wyoming, or, this is how we're going to engage. But you have to understand, and this is kind of the same in Illinois, because, Chicagoland is huge, but the rest of the state of Illinois is quite rural. That this is what we are going to do within the confines of what is the expectation. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Or if you define community as, 10 census blocks or something like that, just to hold a meeting for stakeholders, then you do that. And one of the things, a good example that I've been talking about with your team is you have to also be aware that people's time is valuable and you can't overwhelm stakeholders. So, you might have a meeting where you're bringing in people from a lot of different places. You're having the meeting in Gillette, but you're drawing from a huge area, for example. And that meeting might need to cover several different projects or several different ideas, because you cannot have a meeting like that every single time you want to talk to people about something that you're doing, right? Because then it starts to lose its value.
It's fatiguing.
Its impact.
And I think, you do have to be careful of that. So do you think the community benefits plans are likely to be effective in improving project outcomes for some of these projects?
I think the benefit of community benefit plans, not to sound like that's an oxymoron, but is that they make us more thoughtful and put into consideration social considerations up front. And it is a way of integrating that. If it is the best mechanism for doing it, or if the plans themselves are the end-all be-all, I don't know about that. But what I like about the requirement is that it challenges and sets an expectation that community cannot be left behind,
right?
That it needs to be brought along the entire way. And some of us did that naturally in our early projects, but this is then holding new players in this space to a high standard, which I think is important, because you don't want to repeat the historical leaving people behind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so if anyone wants to learn more about this, is there anywhere you would suggest to be like a top source of information on stakeholder engagement around carbon management?
I don't know that there's a particular website that I would send people to. There are several really good documents and work that's been created over the years. I think that the World Resources Institute, CCS guidelines for carbon capture and storage, and their stakeholder engagement work, which was done in like 2008 and 2010, is still very, very robust and meaningful. I think the U.S. Department of Energy's best practices for educational and project outreach for project developers is very good. There's a new piece of work that I just worked on with the Houston Energy Transition Initiative and HARC that looks at sort of two sides of engagement, from the industrial perspective and also from the community perspective, which I think is a very good piece of work. And people can contact me if they want. My website is www.thesallie.com, and I can put them in touch. There's not exactly a repository, but there's a lot of people who have done work in this space for the last 25 years who can provide insights. I think we probably need to do a little bit better job of pulling some of this out of the academic space and more into the public space.
Yeah, and on that, if any of our listeners are interested about specific projects happening here in Wyoming, you can find those on the School of Energy Resources website. You can also Google the Center for Economic Geology Research and learn about specific projects happening around the state. So you can certainly find information about any projects that you hear about in your community. So the Sallie G, last question. What is your favorite thing about Wyoming or coming here, or a location in Wyoming that you'd like to visit?
So, I have been coming to Wyoming. I think the first time I came here was when the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute was here in Laramie. Mm-hmm. So probably, I want to say 2012, 2013. Oh, I also came here for field camp.
Oh, yeah.
In the 90s. So I love your geology, but that's not what I was going to say. And I have had the opportunity to do a lot of work with the University of Wyoming, and I come a couple times a year. What I really like about Wyoming is there is no degree of separation. Everybody is connected to everybody, and there are so few people here that it is just like there's just so much connection everywhere you go. And, coffee pot conversations turn into this, well, my uncle knows so-and-so who's done this and that. There's so much inherent community here that I really love. The other thing is I drove up from Denver yesterday, up 287, and that drive, big sky and the hills and a little bit of geology. It was windy as heck last night, though, I gotta say.
Yeah, it was bad.
But it is it's stunning. It's such a stunningly beautiful place. Yeah. So I don't know. I have many, many things, and I keep coming back.
Yeah, and we're always happy to have you. So thank you so much for joining us today, sharing a little bit about your expertise and all the work you've been doing. We appreciate all you've done for the carbon management industry, for Wyoming, for me, for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.